Alright guys, I promised to make this video, which is going to be a comparison between SP Akaashi and also SP Oikawa. Now, both of them are power type setters, and in fact, a lot of their kit are actually very similar, which is mainly regarding, for example, guarantee your spiker to be able to crit, etc. So for that reason, and also the fact that obviously SP Oikawa is going to come out in just 3 months' time, I personally wouldn't recommend you guys to summon for both of them. It's more like a decision of picking one and just use it. Now, in terms of which one you actually want to go for, obviously, whilst a lot of their kit are similar, there are still a tiny bit of a difference in terms of like certain situation where one will be better than the other. So I would just kind of want to use this video to kind of categorize everything in terms of what they actually do, and then make a bit of a comparison video so that you guys know exactly what are the main advantage and disadvantage for each of the character, and then that can hopefully help you guys to make up your mind in terms of which one you actually want to summon for. Okay, so let's start off with their setting ability, because they're setters after all. There's already a bit of a difference here. For Akaashi, his setting ability is his skill 2 rather than ultimate attack, and what that basically means is the multiplier will be a lot lower than what Oikawa is able to offer here. Okay, so Oikawa is an ultimate attack, so therefore if you actually have a max level, that's a whooping 320% multiplier. For Akaashi, that just maxed out at only 180. However, obviously with that lower multiplier, he would come with a shorter setting cooldown as well, and in fact his cooldown can actually be reset after setter dump as well. So normally it would be a 6 net crossing kind of cooldown. However, because he will be reset immediately after setter dump, essentially you can actually do get it down to 4 net crossing every now and then. So basically you do a set, you do a setter dump, and then you can go straight back into the setting skill again. Okay, so that's kind of the main idea. Now normally an ultimate attack should have a cooldown of 8 net crossing as well. However, in the case of SP Oikawa, if you have to get him to skill range 2, he can actually reduce that cooldown by 1 for each of his crit, and because he can actually allow you a lot of your characters to actually force that crit, essentially what this can mean is that he can effectively reduce his setting ultimate to once every turn as well. So from frequency perspective, SP Akaashi doesn't actually really win it if you are able to get your Oikawa to skill resistance 2. Okay, so that's something for you guys to bear in mind. If you don't have Oikawa at skill resistance 2, for example, if they're both only at skill resistance 1, then obviously the trade-off is Akaashi have a lower multiplier but also able to use it more frequently, whereas Oikawa are going to be a lot stronger but much longer cooldown, but that kind of gets nullified as skill resistance 2, where Oikawa can also reduce the cooldown frequency to just as frequent as what Akaashi is able to do. Okay, but that's only as skill resistance 2. Then the next thing I'll briefly talk about, because it's a big difference, but because they're so different, it's not really comparable. But basically for Akaashi, his ultimate attack is going to be set dump, and in fact, like purely numerical power wise, it's probably one of the strongest set dump in the game, like purely number wise. It doesn't really have too much additional effect other than resetting the cooldown for his setting skill, but power wise, it's very strong. Whereas for Oikawa, because the ultimate attack is the setting skill, which we already talked about, what he has instead is a surfing skill, but that's not actually an ult, so the multiplier normally should be lower. However, if you can get him to kind of only surf towards kind of the second half of the match, once his I think called guidance, like his guidance buff is completely stacked up, you then get an increasing multiplier to his surfing skill, which then make it almost like an ultimate like as well. Okay, so in other way, both of them are able to hit very hard or have very high numbers for their other skill as well, but once the set dump, one is the serve, so there's going to be a bit of a difference just in terms of which one you actually want. Okay, now, the next thing, which is kind of the core mechanics that they're able to provide, is this mechanics where they can force the spiker to actually crit. But the way they do it is actually very, very different, and that actually has a lot of implications. Okay, so first of all, if we actually talk about the character himself, what's going to happen is that Akaashi, doing Team Awakening, he can give himself a whooping 70% buff to awareness. Outside of Team Awakening, it's only going to be 30%. Okay, so basically, depending on how frequently you are in Team Awakening, this is going to vary quite a bit. Whereas for Oikawa, he is basically able to guarantee all of his touches to be crit, but that once again is only at skill range 2. Otherwise, he doesn't really give himself any particular awareness. He's actually able to provide the whole team with awareness. So basically, the awareness he gives to himself is kind of just being the ones that he will also be given to the team, okay? So I'll cover that in a bit. But one thing that I do want to point out is that as skill resistance 2, he can actually force off his touches guaranteed to crit, okay? Now, so I already talked about how much awareness the setters themselves are able to get. What about the awareness that they are able to bring to the team? Okay, so what Akaashi is able to do is that he's able to give 100% of his own awareness to power spikers when he's actually setting it to them, or if it's a quick spiker, it's only going to be 50% of that awareness. Okay, so now if you actually think about it, let's say doing Team Morale Awakening, what that basically means is that you can give the spiker at least 70%. If you actually build Akaashi with an awareness spell, which vast majority of the time that's going to be my recommendation. What it can happen is that you can easily get Akaashi to at least 100% doing Team Morale Awakening and still a solid 60 or 7% outside of Team Morale Awakening. And what that also then translates to is that whoever he's setting to would essentially get 100% awareness doing Morale Awakening and about 60 or 70% outside of Team Morale Awakening if it's a power spike. Okay, so that's basically how Akaashi is able to force the spiker to be able to crit. Now, Oikawa does it slightly different. Basically, he has this buff called Guidance, which actually need to stack up over time. Now, in order to get the first stack, it's actually very, very easy. Just someone need to spike on the team, or the one diagonal facing him should be spiking, but that should be very, very easy to trigger. If you're attacking, you can just choose that character. If you are not attacking, if you're actually defending, vast majority of the time, you should be building a character such that he's the first one to spike. So what that happens is that as soon as that person spikes, the one diagonal to Oikawa spikes, you can already give your entire team 40% awareness. Okay, so that's kind of what I said here. After the first spike of the match, you can already give the whole team 40% awareness. Now that would actually gradually increase to 100% awareness as well once your guidance buff is actually completely stacked up. However, that normally takes about 3 or 4 rallies. So rather than Akaashi, where kind of the awareness changes slightly depending on whether or not you are inside Team Morale Awakening or outside Team Morale Awakening, for Oikawa it's more that there's a bit of a warming up period where early on for the first 2 or 3 rallies you may not be able to guarantee all of your spikes to be crit. However, afterwards you are pretty much guaranteed to be crit every single time. Okay, so that's kind of the main idea behind the two. Now, this also have one other implication, which I think is very, very important for you guys to understand, and it also would impact the team building, or which setter would be preferred depending on your team building, which is that when Oikawa give the crit or give the awareness, it's basically just passively given to the entire team at all time. Whereas for Akaashi, it's only given, or that awareness is only transferred or buffed up for the spiker who he is setting to. Now, there are 2 implications of this. First of all, if you actually, let's say, have 2 setters on your field, so for example, both Akaashi and also one other setter, you won't actually be able to get this awareness buff every single time, because when your other setter setting instead of Akaashi, they wouldn't be able to actually get this buff. Okay, so that's one thing which is not ideal for Akaashi's point of view. And it also means that, for example, if you actually want certain character to have awareness without being set to, that is also difficult to get. Now, a lot of time it doesn't really matter, because you only need awareness on the one who's actually performing the action, right? And normally you only have one person spiking. So whenever he sets to a spiker, even though the spiker can change, but he is also the one setting, then you can always get that awareness buff across. But the tricky thing is going to come in certain characters such as SP Watsuyumi and also SP Tendo, who actually use the awareness stat as a way to increase their reflex stat or their defensive critting ability. And obviously they are trying to do a crit on their receive or on their block, so they're not actually going to be the one the setter is setting to, and that's also going to be the reason why this is not going to be very useful for those kind of characters, because they won't be the one the setter is setting to, and therefore they will never be able to benefit from this awareness buff. Whereas for Oikawa, it's going to be different. The buff from Oikawa is just going to be passively available the entire time. So therefore, characters such as Tendo and Iwazumi, who actually utilize awareness outside of spiking, are able to benefit from as well. Okay, so that's one difference, which is, I guess, a kind of like advantage Oikawa is going to have. However, everything have like 2 sides of the story. Okay, this can also backfire in certain situations, and that is because your awareness is always going to be high, and therefore if any character have abilities which trigger based on a low awareness, then that is actually going to be harmful or Oikawa. And one classic example is going to be SP Asumu. SP Asumu, if you actually have him as skill range 2, he can actually reduce the cooldown for characters with less than 30% awareness. If you pair him up with Oikawa, you would never make that happen because Oikawa just make sure your characters always have, like let's say 100% awareness, and therefore it would never ever be able to trigger that condition Asumu Miya is able to require. Whereas for Akaashi is going to be different because the check for that awareness in SP Asumu Miya's kit only is done at the start of each rally, whereas the awareness buff is only given by SP Akaashi inside that rally when you actually been setting to someone. So therefore, if you actually play SP Akaashi with SP Asumu, what's going to happen is that you can actually benefit from both sides of the coins, okay? So you're able to benefit from matching the condition of SP Asumu Miya's where it requires a character to be less than 30 awareness at the start of rally, and yet you still have that insane awareness buff doing spiking itself to make sure your spike is still going to be a crit, okay? So that's kind of why there's going to be one difference between the two, which is going to be the timing of when that awareness buff is given. And that is also something for you guys to bear in mind, okay? So if you really want to summarize about this one, is that Akaashi is able to give more awareness, more like guaranteed crit during Timber Awakening. Outside Timber Awakening, it may only be, 60 or 70% or 80%, depending on how you build him. Whereas for Oikawa, he is only able to give that 100% awareness roughly about 3 or 4 rallies afterwards. However, for the first few rallies, he's kind of warming up, and therefore he's not able to guarantee it. And then the other difference is, like I said, it's going to be the timing. SP Oikawa give awareness the entire time, even if your characters are not spiking, whereas SP Akaashi only give that buff at the point where the character is spiking. And that's also going to be different depending on how you team build, because one could be better than another depending on your teammates, okay? So that's going to be the main difference between their ways of guaranteeing the spiker to crit. Even though it's guaranteeing the spiker to crit for both of the character, the way they are doing it is going to be quite different, okay? Now let's move on to the last section, which is going to be the team buff that they're able to provide to the team. Now, for SP Akaashi, what's going to happen is that after each rally, you're going to get 40 morale points. And also, when you're outside of Team Morale Awakening, you're also going to get 25% increase to your block and receive, okay? So there's a bit of like a defensive buff, which is always going to be permanently on. Because if you're actually inside Team Morale Awakening, which is essentially what this 40 morale after each rally will help, then if you're actually inside Team Morale Awakening, it's just going to be 20% increase to all of your stats, like both offensive and also defensive stat. And even if you're outside Team Morale Awakening, sure, you're missing the bit from offensive stats buff, but you still have that defensive buff. Whereas for Oikawa doesn't provide any defensive buff at all, okay? For him, it's all attacking. Now, what he's going to do is that there are two things that he's able to do. For the first one, which is when attack tempo is greater than 5. Actually, this doesn't need 2 to 3 turns to fully stack. It doesn't matter. I don't know why I wrote this now. I don't think this matters. Does the stack actually matter? No, I don't think it matters here. Okay, so anyway, ignore me. So for Oikawa's point of view, when attack tempo is more than 5 stacks, what's going to happen is that you'll be consuming them. And for each of the stack you consume, you're going to increase the spike multiplier, okay? So this is going to be something which is quite unique. Akaashi is not actually able to provide that. So whilst Oikawa is not actually able to provide any kind of like basic stats buff, so for example, not the ones that you'll be getting from Team Morale or of the defensive one, which will be permanently on. However, he's actually able to increase the spike multiplier, which is also quite rare. Not many supporters are actually able to do that, okay? And then in terms of the other type of buff they're able to provide, whoever Akaashi is setting to would be able to get 32 or up to 32% power spike and also 120% strength if it's a power spiker. Otherwise, if it's not a power spike, it's only going to be 40%, and that's only going to be at skill level 4. Now for Oikawa, he's not actually able to provide this to whoever he's set to. Instead, it's going to be the person who is going to be diagonal to him. So it's kind of going to be fixed. Whereas for Akaashi, it's going to be whoever he's set to. So if you have 3 different spikers, assuming Akaashi is also the one doing the setting, then essentially all 3 spikers can can benefit from it. For Oikawa, it's very much consolidated to just one person, and instead what that person's going to be able to do is that he will be getting 30% crit and also a 30% buffing off his basic stat, and also as skill resonance 4, what's going to happen is that you can actually increase the attack stats by 50% of Oikawa's own stat. There's going to be a cap, however, which is about 1,500 basic stat. That's probably more like equivalent to, I don't know, let's say 10 or 20% of buff to the basic stat, depending on which one. The main problem with this one is that a lot of time, obviously, the stats you want to buff up, for example, for Power Spiker or Quick Spiker is the spiking stat, whereas the one Orcal naturally has is more the setting and the serving one, which your Spiker doesn't actually need. So that's kind of why, even though 1,500 might sound like very, very high, I'm not actually sure how feasible it is for Orcal to kind of like meet those kind of basic stats if he can only give 50% of that. So that's just something for you to bear in mind as well. Then the other thing he can also provide is going to be 100% buff to the strength and also 10% buff to attack technique. Now, what makes Oikawa incredibly strong in terms of the buff is the fact that he can actually buff up every single multiplier in the damage formula. If you actually take a look at this, when attack tempo is more than 5, he can actually give increase to spike multiplier, so basically a skill multiplier, and then from skill range 4 he can also buff up both your power quick spiking stat and also your strength and also attack technique. Okay, so he can actually influence every single part of the damage formula, and that basically makes him incredibly strong, because remember, when you have the damage formula and when you have the buff from all of those different categories, it will be multiplying them together, which is obviously a lot better than addition. Now, obviously, the downside of this is that this is only provided to one character, which is the one directly opposite Oikawa. And once again, that's going to be the main difference between the buff between Oikawa and also Akaashi. I would say Akaashi, Oikawa definitely provides much better buff as a whole, especially if you have him as skill resonance 4. To be honest, Akaashi also kind of needs skill resonance 4 in order for those kind of extra buff. I also forgot to write this needs to be a skill resonance 2, and same thing with this as well. So both characters kind of need a bit of a dupe in order to give that kind of insane team buff. However, what Akaashi is able to do is that he can essentially give it to whoever is spiking, which can kind of just mean it's a buff applied to the whole team, because whoever is spiking is always going to be getting it as long as Akaashi is one setting. Whereas for Oikawa, it's going to be different. It's literally going to be down to just one person. So if you actually have someone who's capable of spiking with a short cooldown, then that is actually going to tilt towards Oikawa's favor, because obviously you will get multiple spikes from the same character over and over again, and therefore he can actually benefit from that insane amount of buff. Whereas if you actually have a traditional team building where everyone, for example 3 different spikers, all spike equal amount of time, you just rotate the spike across all of them, then obviously the value of Akaashi might actually outshine what Oikawa is able to do, because he's actually able to give that buff to all of the spikers equally. Okay, that's going to be the quick comparison between the two setters. Now, on high level, like I said, a lot of the gimmicks they do are actually very similar. For example, forcing your spikers to crit, and also giving huge amount of crit damage buff once you have them as skill rating 4, etc. Okay, but at the end of the day, they're also going to be some kind of like nitty gritty stuff, like down to the details, which makes them also slightly different in terms of team building, because of the timing of when they actually apply the buff, how many people they apply the buff to, and also, for example, their warming up period. One is obviously stronger during awakening rather than outside awakening, whereas another character is stronger towards the end of match rather than start the match. Okay, so there are going to be slight differences. The differences, in my opinion, are not big enough for you just to justify for you to summon for both of them, because the vast majority, like the core mechanics they do, are still going to be the same. However, it does make a difference in terms of team building, because certain teams are just going to suit one type of setter slightly better than the other. Okay, but at the end of the day, they are definitely both very good setters, in my opinion. It's more about, you know, thinking about what kind of team you want to build, especially the teammates that you'll be playing those setters alongside with, in order to then decide which setter you actually want. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Let me know what you guys think, and also which setter do you prefer.